Hey, it's Dr. Silva. Thank you for joining me for this talk on paranoid personality disorder. And this is according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which I have a copy of here. But there's actually a text revision, some revisions that came out in 2022. So the most recent edition is the DSM-5-TR. And what I'm going to talk about today, the criteria I'm going to give are according to this most latest edition of the DSM. And so what is paranoid personality disorder? Well, it is a personality disorder, which means that it has to have shown up in early life, by early adulthood at the latest, usually adolescence, and you see the germs of it in childhood. And it's pervasive, which means that it's across the board. It doesn't just occur in certain situations or in the context of certain relationships. So it's not just at work. It's not just with your partner. It is something that's inherent to you. It's deeply ingrained. And it's interesting also because a lot of times the diagnostic criteria will specify that it has to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, academic, or occupational functioning. That's often a criteria for almost all the disorders in the DSM. It says at some point, here are all the symptoms, but at some point, though, it has to be problematic. You could have severe OCD that's just raging, but if it's not bothering anybody and you are functioning, there's no clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or academic functioning, then you'd be hard-pressed to call it a disorder. It's got to be dysfunctional for it to be a disorder. And what's clinically significant? Well, if it's clinically significant, if it requires treatment, if the patient or the patient's family members present and say, help. But we don't see that criterion in this particular disorder because if they have 4 out of 7 of this list, then by definition, they're having difficulty with, at very least, social functioning, if not academic/occupational. And so there are definitely problems interpersonally if you're paranoid. So paranoid personality disorder, not to be confused with paranoid schizophrenia, which we just call schizophrenia now, but there used to be a paranoid type. Not to be confused with delusional disorder, paranoid type, or other syndromes in which a person might be acutely paranoid, including major mood episodes with psychotic features like major depression or bipolar disorder, as well as certain medical conditions, and of course, the abuse of substances, especially amphetamines and methamphetamines, anything that increases dopamine. So we have to rule all that out, and there are criteria for that as well, exclusionary criteria. But let me start with the diagnostic criteria. So criterion A says that there must be a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others. That is the core symptom in paranoid personality disorder, that they are paranoid, to the point that others' motives are interpreted as malevolent. And this begins in early adulthood, again, and it's present in a variety of contexts. According to the DSM, they list 7 possible symptom clusters, and to qualify for diagnosis, at least for research purposes, you need to have at least 4 or more of the following. And I always want to point out that in real life, if I saw a patient with only 3 of these, but they were severe and pervasive, and there's just no doubt that the person is a paranoid personality, I'm not going to not diagnose it, okay? But for research purposes, when we're studying medications and we're trying to determine what are the characteristics, what is the epidemiology of this condition, we have to use operationally defined criteria in order to know whether or not to include or exclude given individuals. So that's why we have these somewhat arbitrary cutoffs. In real life, we would not be held to this strict standard, but officially, they have to have 4 or more of the following. Number 1, the individual suspects, without sufficient basis, that others are exploiting, harming, or deceiving him or her. These individuals always imagining that people are plotting against them, and they often feel that they have been deeply and irreversibly injured by another person with no objective evidence. And so they are quasi-delusional in this regard. They're delusional if the belief is fixed. It's a false belief. They're always jumping to these conclusions and they're always suspecting these things, but they're not necessarily delusional, i.e. out of touch with reality, unless the belief is concrete, it is fixed. They absolutely are convinced that others are doing this, and they cannot be convinced otherwise. So it's a spectrum of severity. Not all of these individuals are necessarily out of touch with reality. Overall, though, they are not necessarily in touch with what's really going on. Number 2, the individual is preoccupied with unjustifiable doubts regarding the loyalty and trustworthiness of friends and associates, i.e., they don't trust anybody. And they are always minutely scrutinizing the actions of other people, looking for evidence of hostile intentions. The defense mechanism, the unconscious defense mechanism, is projection. And there I have a separate video about defense mechanisms. Projection is the classic textbook unconscious ego defense mechanism of the paranoid individual, whatever the diagnosis is. They are taking their fears that are coming up in their own mind because of genetic, chemical, molecular, and psychological aberrations, whatever's causing the paranoia, and they project those fears onto others, ascribing motives to others. Other people must be out to get me because I'm feeling paranoid, I'm feeling afraid. And so because of this, because they're convinced that other people are untrustworthy and that they're plotting against them, the paranoid individuals are always scrutinizing their actions, their statements, and their behaviors, but they're not just screening for evidence of hostile intentions, they're looking for that evidence because they're already convinced. They've projected those motives. And so it's really a self-fulfilling prophecy. And when a friend actually shows loyalty, they're so amazed that they can't believe it. They can't trust it and they can't believe it. When these individuals get into trouble, they expect to be either attacked or ignored. Help is the last thing that they feel that other people are ever going to offer them. And again, that may be a projection. They may be themselves disinclined to help other people because typically these individuals are somewhat socially isolated. They don't trust anybody, so they can't really confide in or get close to anybody. And so if you're not going to be offering help, then you're going to see other people through projection. You're going to see other people as likewise unhelpful. Number 3, these individuals are reluctant to confide in others because of an unwarranted fear that the information might be used maliciously against them. And so, again, this is part of not trusting others and being guarded about your personal information because it might be used against you, even if the information itself is fairly neutral. And so they often refuse to answer personal questions, stating that it's nobody's business. Number 4, the individual reads hidden, demeaning, or threatening meanings in benign remarks or events. So they're misinterpreting reality. For example, an honest mistake made by a store clerk might be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to shortchange. Or the casual, humorous remark made by a coworker might be perceived as a serious character attack, etc. Even compliments can be misinterpreted. For example, a person might admire an acquisition, a recent purchase, and the paranoid personality would interpret that as the person saying that they were maybe being ostentatious, or that they had spent too much money, or that they were somehow being selfish, or etc. Likewise, an offer of help might be interpreted as the person saying that you're not capable of doing it without that sort of thing. Those, I don't want to call them mood congruent interpretations. That's the terminology that we would use if a person were experiencing a major depressive episode. For example, with paranoid features, you would say that their beliefs are mood congruent. Their mood is low, they're depressed, and so their thoughts are negative, and so they're interpreting things along paranoid lines. And that is because there is a major mood disturbance. You would see the same thing in bipolar disorder. But this is paranoid personality disorder. The person, one of the exclusionary criteria that I mentioned before is that the person is not experiencing major depression. This is not because they are in a major depressive episode or a bipolar depressive episode. And so I don't want to call it mood congruent because they may be euthymic. Their mood is sort of chronically dysthymic with all of these symptoms. A person is not typically in a good mood, but they're not experiencing a major mood disturbance. And so I don't want to call it mood congruent, but It is congruent with the way their mind works and with these long-standing pervasive beliefs that they have. Number 5, the individual persistently bears grudges, i.e., is unforgiving of insults or injuries. Actual slights, these aren't imagined slights, but actual yet minor slights arouse major hostility, and these hostile feelings persist for a long time. I did a video on forgiveness and the importance of letting things go, even if you can't condone the act, letting go of blame so that you can move on emotionally. And these individuals can't do that. They can't let go. And especially in as much as they're going to perceive ongoing slights and insults, even if they're imaginary. Number 6, perceives attacks on his or her character or reputation that are not apparent to others, and is quick to react angrily or to counterattack. The person sometimes will strike preemptively, but to them, they're reacting. They're not being preemptive, but in fact, they are actually attacking first. And the paranoid individual, the one who's acutely paranoid, especially people who are on drugs, they're actually quite dangerous. They can be physically violent because they believe that they're acting in self-defense, and yet they're actually the aggressors. One of the most dangerous people out there in terms of mentally ill people are those people that are on meth or crack or similar stimulants and who are paranoid, who are out of touch with reality. Again, they're projecting their fears. Number 7, the individual has recurrent suspicions without justification regarding the fidelity of their spouse or partner, i.e., they are pathologically jealous. And they might gather trivial and circumstantial, quote-unquote, evidence to support their jealous beliefs. They typically want to maintain complete control over their intimate relationships to avoid being betrayed, and they may constantly be questioning the whereabouts, actions, and intentions of their partners because they're questioning their fidelity. Just in general, because these individuals lack trust in others, they tend to have a need for a high degree of control over the people around them. Criterion B, as I mentioned previously, is the exclusion criterion that says that these symptoms, these 4 out of 7, don't occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depressive disorder with psychotic features, or any other psychotic disorder, and it's not attributable to the physiological effects of another medical condition. And I would add to that, it's not due to the physiological effects of a drug of abuse as well. If a person meets criteria for paranoid personality disorder, say in adolescence, and then in early adulthood, they go on to develop schizophrenia, which is a common course, then we say that that paranoid personality, that was actually a premorbid condition. That was part of the prodrome of schizophrenia, part of the foreshadowing. A lot of times individuals begin to get sick before they get full-blown schizophrenia with delusions and hallucination and the cognitive decline. You see a personality change. You do see trouble, say, in academic functioning, a decline there, and maybe they become a little socially isolated. You see maybe changes in their mood, and they can become paranoid, suspicious. They can look like a paranoid personality, and they do meet criteria for that diagnosis, but it's actually part of the prodrome of schizophrenia. So the DSM-5 TR says, call it premorbid paranoid personality disorder. But really, it's part of the prodrome of schizophrenia. It's really schizophrenia, very mild, getting started. So I don't know why that they would want to classify it as 2 separate conditions, because it's the same conditions. Obviously, whatever the pathophysiology is, it's a syndrome, so it's not always the same from one individual to the other. But whatever is causing the schizophrenia, whatever genetic aberration, it's usually genetic, but whatever the problem is with the brain, when you see paranoid personality disorder in adolescence, for example, and then that person develops schizophrenia, that was schizophrenia that you saw at the age of 17 and 18 when they began to experience what relatively could be called mild paranoia. And now they have full-blown schizophrenia where they have delusions and they're hallucinating, they hear voices, people talking about them. It's paranoia, but it is severe paranoia that they cannot be talked out of. It's not just a tendency to be suspicious. It's hardcore beliefs that cannot be allayed. The irony about this condition is that the combative and suspicious nature of these individuals might actually elicit a hostile response in others, which then serves to confirm the individual's original expectations. So when you're adversarial and distrustful, then you might provoke in other people similar reactions where they are now talking about you behind your back because of your behavior. And what you initially imagined is now actually happening, the very thing that they were imagining. So it's ironic. These individuals are frequently litigious, and that certainly makes sense. When these individuals are very young, you might see characteristics of solitariness, poor peer relationships, social anxiety, underachievement in school, and interpersonal hypersensitivity. Childhood trauma is also a risk factor. And as far as genetics, there is an increased prevalence of paranoid personality disorder in relatives of proband individuals with schizophrenia. So the main differential diagnosis for paranoid personality disorder are other mental disorders, other syndromes with psychotic symptoms, such as delusional disorder, persecutory type, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and/or major depressive disorder with psychotic features. We don't actually see hallucinations in paranoid personality disorder. If you see that, then you really have to think either drugs or one of these other conditions. And so that's it. That's paranoid personality disorder. It is one of the personality disorders in cluster A, along with schizoid and schizotypal personality disorders. So I encourage you to check those videos out as well.